It was another slow Tuesday afternoon at the county courthouse, the kind of day where time seemed to drag on forever. Judge Margaret Harrison sat behind her massive wooden bench, flipping through paperwork with barely concealed boredom. She had been doing this job for almost 15 years now, and the novelty had worn off long ago. Today's docket was filled with the usual cases: petty theft, truancy, minor drug possession. Nothing that required much thought or attention. The bailiff called the next case and the heavy courtroom doors swung open. In walked a kid who looked like he had just rolled out of bed. He couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years old, wearing an oversized gray hoodie that hung past his hands and baggy jeans that had seen better days. His sneakers were scuffed and dirty, and he carried a beat-up backpack that looked like it had survived a war. His dark hair was messy, falling into his eyes, and he kept his head down as he shuffled toward the defendant's table. Judge Harrison barely looked up from her notes. She had seen hundreds of kids just like this one walk through her courtroom over the years. They all had the same look: defeated, scared, unprepared for the reality of facing a judge. Most of them showed up without lawyers, without parents, without anyone to speak up for them. It was sad, really, but after so many years, she had learned to keep her emotions at bay. The young man stood at the defendant's table, clutching the straps of his backpack with both hands. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. He just stared down at the floor, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Judge Harrison let out a long sigh that echoed through the quiet courtroom. The few people scattered in the gallery, a clerk, a social worker, and a couple of attorneys waiting for their own cases, all turned to watch. Well, Judge Harrison began, her voice dripping with that particular tone adults use when they're about to lecture someone much younger, another young person who thought they could handle things on their own. "Tell me, son, do you have an attorney representing you today?" The young man mumbled something inaudible, still staring at the floor. "Speak up," the judge commanded, raising her voice. "This is a court of law, not a playground. When I ask you a question, you need to answer clearly so everyone can hear you." "No, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Harrison shook her head slowly, making sure everyone in the courtroom could see her disappointment. "Of course not. Let me guess. You thought you could just walk in here, tell your side of the story, and everything would be fine? Is that what you thought?" The young man didn't respond, which seemed to irritate the judge even more. "Do you understand how serious this is?" She continued, leaning forward on her bench. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in? This isn't a game, young man. This is your future we're talking about here." She launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed speech, one she had given countless times before. She talked about personal responsibility and making good choices. She mentioned something about kids these days not understanding consequences. Her words came out in a steady stream, each sentence more condescending than the last. The court reporter's fingers moved rapidly across her machine, recording every word. The bailiff, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stood near the wall looking slightly uncomfortable. He had seen Judge Harrison in these moods before, and it never felt quite right to him. But it wasn't his place to say anything. "Let me ask you something," Judge Harrison said, her tone shifting to mock sweetness. "Did you finish high school? Or did you drop out to hang around with your friends and get into trouble?" The young man finally looked up slightly, just enough to make brief eye contact with the judge. "I finished school," he said softly. "Oh, you finished school," the judge repeated, her voice heavy with sarcasm. "Well, congratulations. That's the bare minimum we expect from young people in this society. Did you think that was some kind of major accomplishment?" A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was getting harsh even for Judge Harrison. The judge continued her lecture, pointing out how the young man's appearance showed a lack of respect for the court. She commented on his wrinkled hoodie and suggested that maybe if he spent less time looking like a street kid and more time making responsible decisions, he wouldn't be standing in her courtroom. She made a joke about whether he even owned a comb, which drew an awkward chuckle from someone in the back row. What Judge Harrison didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that the person standing before her wasn't a confused teenager at all. His name was David Chen, and he was 28 years old. He had graduated from law school at 19, making him one of the youngest attorneys ever admitted to the state bar. For the past 9 years, he had dedicated his career to fighting for justice in ways most lawyers never would. David worked for a national legal advocacy organization that specialized in exposing corruption and bias in the court system. His youthful appearance, which had been a source of teasing throughout his life, had become his greatest asset in this work. He could walk into places where no one expected an attorney to be, and people would treat him exactly how they treated vulnerable young people every single day. Today was supposed to be a simple observation. David had received permission from the State Judicial Review Board to conduct undercover assessments of courtrooms that had received complaints about unfair treatment of juveniles. He had planned to sit quietly in the gallery and watch, but when he arrived at the courthouse that morning, another investigator called in sick and David made a split-second decision to take their place. He deliberately dressed down, mussed up his hair, and walked into the courtroom as a seeming defendant rather than an observer. The small recording device tucked carefully inside his backpack was capturing every word Judge Harrison said. Every condescending remark, every eye roll, every dismissive gesture, all of it was being documented. David had heard stories about Judge Harrison's behavior, but hearing about something and experiencing it firsthand were two completely different things. As the judge continued her lecture, telling him he needed to grow up and face reality, David remained perfectly still. He played his role flawlessly, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast, the picture of a defeated teenager. Inside, though, his brilliant legal mind was working overtime, cataloging every violation of judicial ethics, every instance of bias, every failure to ensure fair treatment. Judge Harrison finally paused in her speech and looked down at some papers on her desk. "I'm going to assign you a public defender," she announced, as if she were doing him an enormous favor. "Though honestly, I'm not sure it's going to help much at this point." David opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, pretending to be too intimidated to find his words. "What is it?" the judge snapped. "Do you have something to say?" "I just wanted to," David began, then trailed off, letting his voice crack slightly for effect. "Use your big boy words," Judge Harrison said, actually using that phrase in a court of law. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You young people need to learn how to communicate like adults." The bailiff looked away, clearly uncomfortable now. The court reporter's expression remained neutral, but her fingers seemed to press the keys a bit harder. David took a slow breath, staying completely in character. In just a few more minutes, everything was about to change. Judge Harrison had no idea that her entire world was about to come crashing down, all because she couldn't see past a hoodie and messy hair to recognize the brilliant attorney standing right in front of her. Judge Harrison was just getting started. She leaned back in her large leather chair, looking down at David with an expression that mixed pity and annoyance. The power she held in this courtroom had clearly gone to her head over the years, and she seemed to enjoy every moment of it. "You know what your problem is?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. "Kids like you think the rules don't apply to them. You think you can do whatever you want, and then when you get caught, you act all innocent and surprised." David kept his head down, letting her words wash over him. Every syllable was being recorded by the device in his backpack. He had investigated 3 other judges this year, but none of them had been quite this blatant. With their contempt, Judge Harrison was actually making his job easier by being so obvious about her bias. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," the judge demanded suddenly, her voice sharp enough to make the clerk jump slightly in her seat. David slowly raised his head, making sure to keep his expression blank and submissive. His dark eyes met the judge's gaze for just a moment before he looked away again, playing the part of an intimidated teenager perfectly. "That's better," Judge Harrison said, though her tone suggested nothing was actually better at all. "Now let me explain something to you in very simple terms, since I'm not sure you're grasping the situation here." She picked up a pen and started waving it around as she spoke, like a teacher with a pointer. "When you come into my courtroom, you need to show respect. That means dressing appropriately, speaking clearly, and taking responsibility for your actions. Can you understand that, or do I need to use smaller words?" A woman sitting in the gallery, probably a social worker based on her clipboard and tired expression, winced at that comment. Even she seemed to think the judge. "I understand," David mumbled, keeping his voice quiet and unsure. "Do you?" Judge Harrison challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you rolled out of bed, threw on whatever clothes you found on your floor, and wandered in here thinking this was no big deal." "Am I wrong about that?" "No, ma'am," David replied softly. "No, I'm not wrong, or no, that's not what happened." The judge's frustration was growing now, and she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. David hesitated, as if confused by the question. I mean, I did try to look presentable. Judge Harrison actually laughed at that, a cold sound that echoed through the courtroom. You tried? Well, son, you failed. Spectacularly. This is a court of law, not a street corner. When you come before a judge, you wear clean clothes. You comb your hair. You show that you care about making a good impression. The bailiff shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his discomfort becoming more visible by the minute. He had worked in this courthouse for 12 years, and he had seen Judge Harrison be tough on defendants before. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way she kept emphasizing the kid's appearance, or maybe it was the cruel edge in her voice. Whatever it was, it didn't sit right with him. Judge Harrison turned to her computer screen, clicking through something with her mouse. Let me see here. No prior record. First offense. You know what that tells me? It tells me that you've been lucky up until now. You've probably been breaking rules your whole life, but this is the first time you actually got caught. That's not, David started to say, but the judge cut him off immediately. I didn't give you permission to speak, she snapped. When I want your input, I'll ask for it. Until then, you stand there quietly and listen to what I have to say. Do you think you can manage that? David nodded, biting back the words he actually wanted to say. He had dealt with difficult people throughout his career, but staying silent while someone berated him based on nothing but his appearance was harder than he had expected. He thought about all the real teenagers who had stood in this exact spot, facing the same treatment, without any way to defend themselves. That thought helped him stay in character. Here's what's going to happen, Judge Harrison continued, folding her hands on her desk. I'm going to assign you a public defender, though honestly I have my doubts about whether that's going to help. Public defenders are overworked and underpaid, and they don't have time to babysit kids who can't even dress themselves properly. She paused, letting those words sink in. The court reporter kept typing, her face carefully neutral, but David noticed her jaw was clenched tight. In the meantime, the judge went on, I want you to think long and hard about the choices you've made. Think about where you're headed in life. Because let me tell you something. If you keep going down this path, you're going to end up in much bigger trouble than this. You'll be standing in criminal court instead of juvenile court, and those judges won't be nearly as patient with you as I'm being right now. Patient. David almost broke character at that word. There was nothing patient about what was happening in this courtroom. This was humiliation, plain and simple. Judge Harrison was using her position to belittle someone she perceived as powerless, someone who couldn't fight back. Do you have anything to say for yourself? The judge asked, her tone making it clear she didn't expect anything worthwhile. David let his voice trail off, as if he couldn't find the words. You just what? Judge Harrison pressed. Come on, use that brain of yours. I'm assuming you have one, though you're not giving me much evidence of it so far. A few people in the courtroom were starting to look genuinely disturbed now. The social worker was writing something down on her clipboard with quick, angry strokes. The bailiff was staring at the floor. Even the clerk seemed uncomfortable, though she kept her eyes focused on her computer screen. I was going to say, David continued slowly, that I would like to explain the situation, if that's okay. Oh, you want to explain? Judge Harrison's eyebrows shot up. Let me guess, it's not your fault, right? It's never your fault. There were circumstances beyond your control. Your friends pressured you. You didn't mean for things to happen the way they did. Am I getting warm here? Not exactly, David said quietly. Then enlighten me, the judge said, spreading her hands wide. Tell me your story. I'm sure it's fascinating. David looked up at her, and for just a split second, something changed in his expression. It was subtle. So subtle that most people in the courtroom didn't even notice. But the bailiff caught it, and so did the court reporter. There was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, an intelligence that didn't match the confused teenager act he had been putting on. Your Honor, David began, his voice still quiet but somehow different now. I appreciate your concerns about my appearance and my attitude. I really do. But I think there might be a misunderstanding here. A misunderstanding? Judge Harrison repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. What kind of misunderstanding could there possibly be? You're here because you broke the law. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a fact, actually, David said, and this time his voice was clearer, more confident. That's not exactly why I'm here. The judge frowned, clearly not used to being contradicted. "Excuse me?" David straightened up slowly, pulling his shoulders back. The defeated slouch disappeared, replaced by a posture that radiated quiet confidence. He reached into his backpack and several people in the courtroom tensed, wondering what he was about to pull out. What came out wasn't what anyone expected. It was a wallet, expensive leather, worn but well-maintained. David flipped it open carefully, deliberately, and held it up so Judge Harrison could see. "Your Honor," he said, his voice completely different now, articulate, professional, authoritative. "My name is David Chen. I'm a licensed attorney, admitted to practice law in this state for the past 9 years." The courtroom went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Judge Harrison's face went pale, then flushed red, then pale again in the span of about 3 seconds. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again without any sound coming out. The bailiff's eyes went wide. The court reporter's hands froze above her machine. The social worker in the gallery sat up straight, suddenly very interested in what was happening. David pulled out his state bar card, holding it up alongside his identification. Both clearly showed his name, his photograph, and his credentials. There was no mistaking it. The person Judge Harrison had been mocking and belittling for the past 20 minutes wasn't a confused teenager at all. He was a lawyer. And from the look on his face, he had heard every single word she had said. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for what felt like forever. Judge Harrison stared at the identification cards David was holding up, her brain apparently refusing to process what she was seeing. Her face had gone through several shades of red and was now settling into an unhealthy-looking gray color. That's not possible," she finally stammered, finding her voice. "You're just a kid. You can't be—" "I'm 28 years old," David said calmly, lowering the cards but keeping them visible. "I graduated from law school when I was 19. I've been practicing law in this state ever since. Would you like to verify my bar number?" The court reporter had recovered from her shock, and her fingers were flying across her machine again, making sure every word of this exchange was recorded. The bailiff looked like he was trying very hard not to smile. This was probably the most interesting thing that had happened in this courtroom in years. Judge Harrison's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak again. "Why didn't you identify yourself when you walked in here? This is completely inappropriate. You made me think— I made you think I was a young defendant who needed help," David interrupted gently. "Which is interesting because that's exactly what I was supposed to be observing today. How you treat young people who come into your courtroom." The judge's hands were shaking now. She gripped the edge of her bench to steady them. "Observing? What are you talking about? Who sent you here?" David reached into his backpack again, this time pulling out a tablet. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward the judge. "I work for the National Justice Advocacy Project. We're a legal organization that investigates complaints about judicial misconduct and bias in court systems across the country. 3 months ago, your courthouse received multiple complaints about the way juvenile defendants are treated in your courtroom specifically." "That's ridiculous," Judge Harrison said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I treat everyone fairly. I've been a judge for 15 years. However, the State Judicial Review Board granted us permission to conduct undercover observations," David continued, his voice remaining professional and calm. "I have the authorization documents right here if you'd like to see them. The original plan was for me to sit in the gallery and watch today's proceedings. But when another investigator called in sick this morning, I made the decision to take a more direct approach." He swiped through several screens on his tablet, then looked back up at the judge. "I wanted to experience firsthand how you interact with someone you perceive to be a vulnerable young person, without proper representation. And I have to say, Your Honor, the experience was even worse than the complaint suggested." The social worker in the gallery was now taking notes furiously. The clerk had stopped pretending to work on her computer, and was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. This was going to be the talk of the courthouse for months. "You tricked me," Judge Harrison said, her voice rising with a mix of anger and panic. "You deliberately deceived this court. That's unethical. I'll file a complaint against you with the Bar Association." You'll what?" David asked, and for the first time there was an edge to his voice. "File a complaint because I witnessed you mocking someone you thought was a teenager? Because I recorded you making fun of a young person's appearance and intelligence? Because I documented you denying someone the opportunity to speak on their own behalf? He held up his backpack slightly. Everything you said in the last 20 minutes has been recorded. Every condescending comment, every eye roll, every time you interrupted me or refused to let me explain the situation. All of it. Judge Harrison looked like she might be sick. You recorded me without my knowledge? That's illegal wiretapping. You can't use that in any kind of proceeding. Actually, David said, pulling out a small laminated card from his wallet. This courtroom is already recorded. There's a sign posted right outside those doors informing everyone that proceedings may be monitored for quality and training purposes. You approved that policy yourself 2 years ago. I simply made my own recording to ensure accuracy. The bailiff couldn't help himself anymore and let out a small cough that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. He quickly composed himself, but the damage was done. Judge Harrison shot him a furious look before turning back to David. What do you want? She asked, and now her voice was small, defeated. Are you here to humiliate me? To ruin my career? I'm here to document the truth, David replied. And the truth is that you treated someone you believed to be a scared, confused teenager with nothing but contempt and mockery. You judged me based entirely on my appearance. You made assumptions about my intelligence, my character, and my future without knowing a single real fact about me. He tapped his tablet screen again. But here's the thing, Your Honor. I'm not actually the problem here. I'm a grown man with a law degree and 9 years of experience. I can handle being talked down to for 20 minutes. I knew what I was walking into and I chose to be here. David's expression became more serious. But what about all the real teenagers who've stood where I'm standing? The ones who actually are scared and confused? The ones who don't have law degrees or advocacy organizations backing them up? How do you think they feel when you treat them the way you just treated me? Judge Harrison didn't answer. She couldn't, because they both knew exactly how those kids felt. I have documentation here, David continued, scrolling through his tablet, of 17 separate cases from the past 6 months alone where you made similar comments to juvenile defendants. Cases where you judged young people based on their clothing, their hairstyle, their way of speaking. Cases where you denied them the chance to explain their circumstances because you had already decided what kind of people they were. He looked up from the tablet, meeting the judge's eyes directly. In 4 of those cases, the charges were eventually dropped completely. Those kids were innocent, but you had already treated them like criminals based on nothing but how they looked. The courtroom was absolutely silent, except for the soft clicking of the court reporter's machine. Everyone was hanging on every word, watching this incredible reversal of power unfold before their eyes. One of those kids, David said quietly, was a 15-year-old honor student who had been picked up by mistake. Wrong place, wrong time. Looked similar to someone the police were actually searching for. He stood in this courtroom in his school clothes, terrified, trying to explain that there had been a mistake. You told him to stop making excuses and take responsibility for his actions. You lectured him for 10 minutes about respect and accountability. David's jaw tightened. He spent 3 days in juvenile detention before someone finally checked the security footage and proved he couldn't have been involved. 3 days. And you never apologized. Judge Harrison's face crumbled. I don't. I didn't know. That's exactly the point, David said. You didn't know. You didn't know anything about him or about me or about any of these young people, but that didn't stop you from judging them, from mocking them, from treating them like they were worthless. He closed the tablet and put it back in his backpack. I'll be submitting my full report to the Judicial Review Board by the end of this week. They'll launch a formal investigation into your conduct. Every case you've presided over in the past 3 years will be examined. And based on what I witnessed today, I expect there will be significant consequences. Judge Harrison slumped in her chair, looking suddenly much older than her years. The power and authority she had wielded so carelessly just minutes ago had completely evaporated. David picked up his backpack and turned to leave, but then paused and looked back at the judge one more time. For what it's worth, he said, his voice softer now, I hope you learned something from this. These kids deserve better. They deserve a judge who sees them as human beings, not as problems to be solved or lessons to be taught. They deserve someone who will listen to them with an open mind instead of deciding who they are, based on a hoodie and messy hair. With that, he walked toward the courtroom doors. The bailiff quickly moved to open them for him. As David stepped through, he could hear Judge Harrison's quiet voice behind him. Wait, please. But David kept walking. He had said everything that needed to be said. Now it was up to the system to do its job. The news spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Within an hour of David walking out of that courtroom, every clerk, bailiff, and attorney in the building knew what had happened. By the end of the day, the story had reached the local news stations. By the next morning, it was everywhere. David sat in his small office at the National Justice Advocacy Project headquarters, watching his phone light up with notification after notification. News outlets wanted interviews. Legal blogs were already writing about the case. Social media was exploding with reactions. Some people were calling him a hero. Others were accusing him of entrapment and unethical behavior. He ignored most of it and focused on what really mattered: his report. He had spent the entire night going through his recordings, his notes, and the case files he had collected over the past 3 months. The evidence was overwhelming. Judge Harrison hadn't just been having a bad day. This was a pattern that had been going on for years, affecting countless young people who had no voice and no way to fight back. 2 days after the courtroom incident, David submitted his formal report to the State Judicial Review Board. It was 73 pages long, meticulously detailed and backed up by audio recordings, court transcripts, and interviews with former defendants and their families. He also included statements from court staff who had witnessed Judge Harrison's behavior, but felt powerless to speak up. The Judicial Review Board moved faster than David had expected. Within a week, Judge Harrison was placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. She was ordered to stay away from the courthouse and forbidden from presiding over any cases until the investigation was complete. The media attention intensified. Reporters camped outside the courthouse trying to get comments from anyone involved. Judge Harrison's attorney released a statement claiming that his client had always acted with the best intentions and that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But public opinion was not on her side. The real turning point came when other people started coming forward. A woman named Patricia Rodriguez contacted David's organization with a story about her son. 3 years ago, when he was 16, he had appeared in Judge Harrison's courtroom for a minor shoplifting charge. The judge had berated him so harshly that he broke down crying in front of everyone. She made comments about how boys from certain neighborhoods always ended up in trouble. Patricia's son had been so traumatized by the experience that he refused to talk about it for months afterward. "I thought that was just how judges were," Patricia told David during a phone call, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought maybe we deserved it somehow. But watching the news and hearing what happened to you, I realized it wasn't normal. It wasn't right." More stories came flooding in. A father whose daughter had been humiliated in court over her tattoos and purple hair, even though she was there for a traffic violation. A grandmother who watched helplessly as Judge Harrison dismissed her grandson's learning disability as just an excuse for bad behavior. A social worker who had filed multiple complaints over the years, only to be told there wasn't enough evidence to take action. David documented everything. Each new story added another layer to the investigation, painting a picture of a judge who had let her power corrupt her sense of justice and compassion. The Judicial Review Board expanded their investigation from 3 years to 5 years. They began examining over 300 cases that Judge Harrison had presided over. Legal experts were brought in to analyze court transcripts. Psychologists were consulted about the potential harm caused to Yun. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison's reputation was crumbling. Colleagues who had worked with her for years started distancing themselves. Some admitted they had noticed troubling behavior but hadn't wanted to get involved. Others claimed they had no idea things were that bad. The courthouse environment became tense and uncomfortable, with everyone wondering if they could have done something sooner. David received a call from the review board's lead investigator, a serious woman named Linda Park, who had been practicing law longer than David had been alive. She wanted to meet with him in person to go over some of the details of his report. They met at a quiet coffee shop downtown, away from the media circus at the courthouse. Linda arrived with 3 thick binders full of documents. She looked tired but determined. "I've been doing this job for 18 years, Linda said as she sat down across from David. "I've investigated judges who took bribes, judges who fell asleep during trials, judges who showed up drunk. But this case is different. This is about something more subtle and more damaging in some ways." David nodded, sipping his coffee. "Because it's about dignity. It's about treating people like they matter. Exactly, Linda agreed. And the hard part is that Judge Harrison genuinely believes she was helping these kids. She thinks being tough on them, humiliating them a little, would teach them a lesson and set them straight. She doesn't see the harm she caused. She opened one of the binders and showed David a stack of statements. We've identified at least 47 cases where her behavior crossed the line into misconduct. Some are worse than others, but the pattern is undeniable. She systematically treated young defendants, especially those from lower-income backgrounds or minority communities, with contempt and prejudice. What happens next? David asked. Linda leaned back in her chair. The board will make their formal recommendation within 2 weeks. Based on what we've found, I'd be shocked if she isn't removed from the bench permanently. There will also likely be recommendations for policy changes throughout the court system to prevent this from happening again. She paused, looking at David carefully. You should know that Judge Harrison's attorneys are preparing to fight back. They're going to argue that your undercover operation was unethical and that any evidence you gathered should be inadmissible. They're also planning to paint you as someone with an agenda against judges in general. David wasn't surprised. He had expected this. My recording might be challenged, but what about all the court transcripts? Those are official records. What about all the people who've come forward with their own experiences? I'm just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. That's true, Linda said. And that's why I think we have a strong case. Your investigation was the catalyst, but the evidence goes far beyond what happened in that courtroom with you. Over the next week, the investigation continued to unfold. Local news stations ran segments featuring some of the families affected by Judge Harrison's behavior. Legal experts debated judicial ethics on talk shows. The story became a national conversation about how the justice system treats young people, especially those who can't afford expensive lawyers or who don't fit society's image of a good kid. David participated in a few carefully selected interviews, always steering the conversation away from himself and toward the larger issues at hand. He talked about the need for better training for judges on implicit bias. He discussed the importance of treating every defendant, regardless of age or appearance, with basic respect and dignity. He emphasized that this wasn't about destroying one person's career, it was about fixing a broken system. But privately, in his quiet moments, David thought about all the kids who had stood where he stood, facing Judge Harrison's wrath without any way to defend themselves. He thought about the 15-year-old honor student who spent 3 days in detention for a crime he didn't commit. He thought about the boy who cried in front of the whole courtroom because a judge decided to humiliate him. Those were the people this was really about. Those were the voices that needed to be heard. 2 weeks after David's report was submitted, the Judicial Review Board announced they would be holding a public hearing. Judge Harrison would have the opportunity to respond to the allegations. The evidence would be presented. A decision would be made. David prepared his testimony carefully. He reviewed his recordings one more time, read through all the supporting documents, and practiced staying calm and professional no matter what accusations might be thrown his way. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. The courtroom where it would take place was expected to be packed with media, legal observers, and members of the public who wanted to see justice served. As David packed up his briefcase the night before the hearing, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Hello? There was a long pause on the other end, and then a familiar voice spoke. It was Judge Harrison. Mr. Chen, she said quietly. I need to talk to you. David stood frozen in his apartment, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the silence on the other end. Judge Harrison had just said his name, and now neither of them seemed to know what to say next. How did you get my number? David finally asked, keeping his voice neutral. That's not important, Judge Harrison replied. Her voice sounded different than it had in the courtroom, smaller, tired. I know I shouldn't be calling you. My lawyers would have a fit if they knew. But I needed to talk to you before the hearing tomorrow. David walked over to his couch and sat down. I'm listening. There was another long pause. He could hear her breathing on the other end, could almost feel her struggling to find the right words. I want to resign, she said finally. Before the hearing, before all of this gets dragged out in public even more than it already has, I'll step down quietly and we can all move on. That's not really up to me, David said carefully. The investigation is being handled by the Judicial Review Board. I'm just a witness at this point. But you started all of this, Judge Harrison said. and there was a hint of her old sharpness in her voice now. "You're the one who walked into my courtroom and set this whole thing in motion. Surely you have some influence over how it ends." David rubbed his eyes. It had been a long few weeks, and he was exhausted. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I didn't start this. You started this years ago every time you treated a young person with contempt instead of compassion. Every time you judged someone based on how they looked instead of listening to their story. I just finally documented what was already happening. I was trying to help them," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "I thought if I was tough on these kids, if I showed them how serious their situations were, maybe they'd turn their lives around. Maybe they'd think twice before getting into trouble again." "And did it work?" David asked quietly. "Did humiliating them make them better people? Or did it just make them feel worthless and afraid?" Judge Harrison didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know anymore. I thought I was doing the right thing. I really did." David felt a flicker of something. Not quite sympathy, but maybe understanding. He had seen this before in his work. People who started out with good intentions, but somewhere along the way, lost sight of the humanity of the people they were supposed to serve. "There's a 15-year-old kid," David said, "who spent 3 days in juvenile detention because you didn't take the time to listen to him. He was innocent, completely innocent, and you treated him like he was already guilty because of how he looked and where he came from." "I know," Judge Harrison said. "I've read all the reports. I've seen all the cases they're investigating. And She trailed off, and David heard what might have been a sob. "I don't remember most of them. That's the worst part. These kids and their families, they remember every word I said, every look I gave them. It affected their lives. But for me, it was just another Tuesday. Just another case." The honesty in her words hit David harder than he expected. This was the real tragedy. Not that Judge Harrison was cruel, but that she had become so disconnected from the impact of her actions that she didn't even register the harm she was causing. "So what do you want from me?" David asked. "Why did you really call?" "I want you to know that I'm sorry," she said. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't undo the damage I caused. But I need to say it to someone, and you're the only person who might understand why I did what I did, even if you don't agree with it." David thought about this for a moment. "I do understand, actually. You got comfortable in your power. You stopped seeing defendants as people and started seeing them as problems. It happens more often than you'd think. That's why we do the work we do." "Will you tell them I'm sorry?" Judge Harrison asked. "The families, the kids. Will you tell them that I never meant to hurt them?" "No," David said firmly. "If you're truly sorry, you need to tell them yourself. At the hearing tomorrow, stand up in front of everyone and take responsibility for what you did. Don't hide behind a resignation or a lawyer's statement. Face the people you hurt and apologize to them directly." There was a long silence. "I can't do that," she finally said. "I just can't." "Then your apology doesn't mean much, does it?" David replied, not unkindly. "Real accountability isn't about feeling bad in private.